Hello, welcome to Pham Dialogues.
Where two Vietnamese Americans have casual conversations about Vietnamese history.
We're your hosts, Yen
and Kevin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. How are you feeling, Yen?
I am sick like a dog, but you know what? I'm still showing up.
Yeah, it's too bad, listeners. You might feel sick listening to Yen. She sounds terrible right now.
And I'm glad that you can't actually see me because I look terrible as well.
It's okay. As you remember from the last episode in our Ideas of Freedom series, we talked about liberal education in Vietnam. What kind of education should the Vietnamese people have? Should they have a liberal arts education? And what does that mean? Well, today we're going to talk about something a little different, but related to freedom.
As promised, we will be talking about the Nhân văn Giải Phẫm period. And this is a hot topic in Vietnamese history.
Right. And a very fascinating period for universal reasons, too. Even if you don't know anything about Vietnam, you don't really care about Vietnam, you should care about this if you care about the idea of freedom.
So, Kevin, what is the Nhân văn Giải Phẫm and why is it important to discussions about freedom in Vietnam and just freedom in general?
Wonderful question. So when anti-colonial activists and people who are interested in anti-colonialism talk about Vietnam, they tend to point to this moment in 1954 when the Viet Minh defeat the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, ending almost 100 years of French colonialism in Vietnam. However, not many of them seem to be aware that at the same time, those Vietnamese communists were fighting an internal struggle against Vietnamese landlords and people that they thought were Vietnamese reactionaries or capitalists. And so the Nhân văn Giải Phẫm is interesting because it's a movement that happens around this period, kicking out the French, but at the same time, there's the question of what is the status of free speech? So the Vietnamese who participated in kicking out the French, they had spent decades really disciplining themselves and unifying with each other and tightening their social bonds. Well, now that the French are out of the picture in North Vietnam, some intellectuals and artists were thinking, you know what? We spent all that time disciplining ourselves. I think it's time to relax a little bit because we have independence now, right? And so let's have free speech and let's be able to express ourselves.
Right. I think this is a good premise for why we're doing the series on freedom in general, especially in relation to Vietnam, is nuancing these very broad, very seemingly absolute ideas like freedom and thinking about, well, this struggle for freedom is actually continuous because once you kick out the common enemy, well, there are potential enemies among us. How do we deal with that?
Exactly. And also, it's the question of how do you do revolution? So these communist revolutionaries wanted to change society. They didn't want to just kick out the French. They wanted to transform Vietnamese society into a socialist one. What role does free speech have in that? And just for some historical context, we're talking about the mid-1950s. Joseph Stalin dies in 1953. Today, everyone kind of knows him as this dictator, right? Well, there's a process of de-Stalinization throughout the communist world, especially in Eastern Europe. And around this time as well, the Chinese Revolution is having a similar movement called the 100 Flowers movement. So we might say this is the Vietnamese version of it, right?
There are definitely some overlaps. Like you said, that now that there's no longer a common enemy, we can potentially, quote unquote, relax a little bit, maybe work on the internal politics. And what happened in China with the 100 Flowers movement was that Mao wanted to open up criticisms for the public to chime in terms of his politics. And as you know, this is a fundamental aspect of Marxism. So, in order to have strong politics, there needs to be a recognition of one's weaknesses, criticisms, and ways to move on from them. And so, this was the opportunity that Mao wanted to encourage in the 100 Flowers movement. Things did not necessarily plan out the way that he wanted and the way that the intellectuals who participated wanted, but that is not the scope of this episode. Turn things back to Vietnam, though, I think there wasn't the same kind of call for criticisms, even though criticism and self criticism have continuously been in the mind of people who are participating in the revolution. I think they're always thinking about ways to improve. So that's where I would say there is the distinction from the 100 Flowers movement.
Yeah, so I think Yen might have a point when she says that there wasn't really a call, but there's one thing that we didn't mention yet, or at least go into detail about, which is the land reform campaign that was happening around 1952 to 1956. And so during this time, Vietnamese communist revolutionaries were struggling against Vietnamese landlords or perceived landlords and taking land from perceived rich people and redistributing it to the poor peasants. And the leadership admitted to making mistakes and committing excesses and unjust persecutions. And so there was a speech by Vong Nguyen Giáp admitting to this,
You're
saying,
right.
well,
You're
we
right.
need to
Yeah.
be better, right? So one might interpret this as, okay, well, they're admitting to mistakes. It's time to admit to mistakes. And this criticism and self-criticism that Yen mentioned, it's a practice that was arguably created or invented by Stalin. Stalin talked about it, and it was really Mao who really wrote a lot about it. And then Ho Chi Minh basically says the most important thing that any revolutionary could do is criticism and self-criticism. It's kind of like cleaning yourself and
Right.
purifying yourself.
I just have to say that gives me flashbacks to going to confession
Oh
as a
yeah, it's just like
like for
confession.
communion, right? Oh man, just before you go into confession, you have sedmin. So it's like search your consciousness, right? No, examination of conscience. And you
Mhm.
go through the 10 commandments, which sins have you committed? And that's before you go into the quote unquote public confession with the priest.
Say more about the public confessions. That's
Sorry,
relevant.
what I mean by public is it's not public, but it's shared. And I only said public because that's the parallel that I drew with the self criticisms of the Communist Party, where there would be these public trials that would be held.
Right. I remember doing confession once because I was raised Catholic, and I
Just
remember,
once? Oh,
you know, I said
Kevin.
to the priest, I was in the second grade, and I was, how old are you in the second grade? Like
Like 8.
7. And I said, I called this kid at school a and the priest just he didn't even say anything. He just said, okay, repeat after me. And then we said like a prayer, like Hail Marys or something. But I didn't learn anything. What's interesting that Yen brought up, though, this idea of confession, it's also sort of a form of social control, right? It's a
Absolutely.
form of social pressure. There's this wonderful memoir called The Gate. It's this French anthropologist who was basically kidnapped by the Khmer Rouge, and the Khmer Rouge were communists as well, and they were exercising this criticism and self-criticism sessions, and this French anthropologist got to see it. And so there was a Khmer Rouge commander, and he's standing in front of the comrades, and he's like, does anyone have any confession or criticism to make today? Then one guy goes, I do. Yesterday, it started raining and I forgot to take in everybody's clothes and it all got wet. And I forgot because I was lazy. That's how I failed as a revolutionary. I made it harder for everybody else. And so the commander's kind of like, okay, good enough. And then he looks around expecting for someone else to volunteer self-criticism, but nobody really says something. So then he kind of just points at somebody with his lips.
Mm,
Like, and that's interesting because he didn't point with his finger, because if you demand it, then it's not really voluntary, you know? So this criticism, self-criticism, like you're trying to pressure people into volunteering criticism.
Right. I mean, ideally, it was supposed to keep people in check. It is like confession, the
Right.
Catholic confession. If you do certain things, you're going to have to own up to those things.
Right. Yeah.
And in terms of party politics, that was the logic behind having criticisms. It doesn't always work in the example that you provided. It's like you have to fill a certain quota. Someone has to own up to a sin, or else it seems like this performance is pointless.
Right. So going back to the Yanbanzai Pham movement, would you say that this is a form of criticism, self-criticism, or was it something else?
Right. I think so. Okay. And I think this is a good segue point to. We're not going to go into the historiography of Nhân Saifam, but I think it's important to mention at least two ways that the Nhân Saifam have been examined. So, on the one hand, some scholars have said that Nhân Saifam is an example of dissidence from the party. And these people are maybe not anti communists outright, but they're pushing back against party politics. On the other hand, Kevin, do you want to speak to the other position that's
Yeah.
out there?
Yeah, so it's interesting when we try to find information about the Yanbanzai Pham, a lot of it might come from people who are very anti-communist, and they use the Yanbanzai Pham as an example of how terrible communism is, because here you have a movement of writers who are criticizing the Communist Party and who are demanding more freedom of speech. However, when you actually read the writings of the participants of the Nyanvan Pham, you begin to notice that they were quite explicitly pro-communist. They were at least very sympathetic. They claimed to follow socialism. They claimed to follow Marxism and Leninism. Now, of course, one might argue that, oh, they're actually being strategic. They're engaged in strategic genuflection. They're just saying nice things when really they're
Mm.
trying to be subversive. Now, you might say that, but then at the end, it's like, well, how do we know? Maybe they're being strategic and maybe they don't really mean what they're saying, but maybe they do. Some historians, such as Peter Zinnemann, he will say it's actually problematic to paint all of them as dissidents, the people in the Nyanvan because to be a dissident, you're someone who disagrees with the ideology or at least challenges the ideology. Well, actually, if you actually read these writings, they're not challenging the ideology. They're just critiquing the way to get
The
to their
practice, right?
goal, right? The
Mm-hmm.
practice, right? They don't have a
Mm.
problem with ideology, they have a problem with the practice.
So I have two things I want to say. So I agree with you in that the Nyenman Seifam has always been so fascinating to especially Western scholars because it's a way for them to say, oh, this could potentially be anti-communist, even though without outrightly saying it's like an oblique attack toward communist politics. And it's the same way that Zung Tu Hung, even Nguyen Huy Thiep, these writers who are quote unquote dissidents are so popular in the West because they write against the Communist Party. I think there's a certain fascination with that. And then the other thing I wanted to say was that indeed the intellectuals that participate in the Nhân Pham, I wouldn't say that they were against the communist ideology. There was actually this unspoken agreement between intellectuals and the revolutionary movement that if we help you, you help us. So you're helping us break away from French colonialization and then potentially providing us with a different kind of society so that we can express ourselves. And in turn, you also have to endorse our intellectual and creative freedom. So there's this quid pro quo that is not necessarily written out in a contract, but was understood between the intellectuals and the party members, I think.
Yeah, the question of what role does an intellectual have in a revolution, that is one thing that these people discussed.
The revolution wouldn't have succeeded without the intellectuals. Many of these intellectuals provided financial support as well as moral and moral
Right. For
support.
example, one key figure, Nguyen Man Doong, he donated a bunch of his family property to the
Mm-hmm.
revolution. So, Yen, why do you think that the Nhân Văn Giải Phóng is significant for discussions about freedom in general and freedom in Vietnam?
So, as a literary scholar, I am always really fascinated with moments where writers are defending their creative expression. And so this is what we're seeing here with this Nhân văn Giải Phẫm period. Let's just clarify actually. Nhân văn and Giải Phẫm are two periodicals that came out in the 1950s. Giải Phẫm actually came out first with publication of Giải Phẫm was one in February 1956, and then onward there were a couple more issues. And then after that, by the end of the year, another periodical that was weekly came out called Nhân văn. So when we say Nhân văn Giải Phẫm, we're referring to these journals that were published either seasonally with Giải Phẫm or Nhân văn, which is weekly. Giải Phẫm means fine works or masterpieces, and Nhân văn refers to humanities. And actually, I have to specify because I am a literary scholar, it's humanities through a lens of literature. So Nyen's with human and Van is literature. And so it is this nod to Han root. I think that's really important to what I'm interested in, what we're discussing here in terms of creative expression in cultural productions. And for you, Kevin, like why does Nhân văn Giải Phẫm fascinate you?
I think the Nhân văn Giải Phẫm is really interesting because when I read what they say, they seem to be defending free speech by using an argument that sounds very different from typical defenses of free speech that I'm used to in the West. Like in the United States, when people demand free speech, they say free speech is important because it's my right. It's my individual God-given right, and you shouldn't take it away from me. Well, that's not how the Nhân văn Giải Phẫm defend free speech. Instead, they defend it in terms of political functionality, like free speech is an instrument or a tool that will help us get to the society we want. It'll help us in order to get to socialism. So that's really interesting. And also, it's interesting because their defense of free speech is different from typical Marxist defenses of free speech. I bet some people might be surprised to hear that Karl Marx really defended free speech, especially in the United States, where people might have an idea of Karl Marx as like some kind of dictator or something. Well, he actually really defended free speech, and he thought that the right to free speech protects a vital interest. Like you have an interest in saying what you want, and this right to free speech for Marx is different from the right to property. So he had a problem with the right to property because often people will use that right in order to accumulate wealth for themselves, and that makes the masses miserable. So Karl Marx criticizes the right to property, but he definitely protects and really loves the right to speech. But for Marx, free speech can be used also by the masses to win power from the capitalists. Like there are way more masses, way more workers than capitalists. So if the workers are able to communicate with each other, then they can come together and get power and win over the capitalists. And this is different from the Nhân văn Giải Phẫm because they already have power. The communists have already won, at least by kicking out the French and in North Vietnam. And so they take their power for granted and they use free speech for social transition. Does that make sense? So that's how I think their arguments for free speech are different.
So as you can see, the Nhân văn Giải Phẫm is fascinating for me as a literary scholar, and then Kevin as a political theorist, and we've taken two completely different lenses to look at this period. I'm curious about the political functionality of free speech. Kevin, can you say a little bit more about that?
Before I do that, I want to talk about a podcast episode that I listened to that really captures this so perfectly. And it's a true story. So there were these men working on an oil rig in the ocean, and they were very manly men. I don't know if you've ever seen these YouTube videos of oil rig workers, but it looks like a really dangerous job. And this podcast episode was talking about how the men were literally just losing limbs all the time, like
Whoa.
getting their arms and legs chopped off and dying actually quite frequently. So many injuries, so many accidents, so many mistakes. And the podcast was also talking about how the men had a culture in which they engaged in a lot of self-censorship. Like they thought it was not manly to say what they really thought. It was not manly to express their need for help, for instance, or they wouldn't admit that they weren't up to a particular task. They just didn't talk much. They didn't feel free. So then what the company did was they hired somebody, a consultant, and they put these men through this program to get them to open up and talk about their feelings. And then eventually, like the men started crying with each other, started admitting things to each other. And after this program, accidents fell by 86%. And the profits of the Shell Oil Company skyrocketed. And so this is really helpful because these oil drillers had a capitalist goal to drill as much oil as efficiently as possible to minimize mistakes, and they succeeded, and they used free speech to succeed. Free speech allowed them to identify their mistakes, to get them to be open to different perspectives about how to accomplish the goal, and it worked. Well, the Nyanvan Zaifam also have a goal, but it's anti-capitalist. It's a socialist goal. And they think that free speech can function the same way to get them to that goal by identifying mistakes and so on. For example, their goal is happiness of the people. So one participant of the Nyanvan Zaifam says, there's not a single one of us who demands democracy and freedom to say whatever we want, to do whatever we want, to damage the interests of the regime and the people's happiness, which is our happiness and my wife's and children's. See, so that's really interesting. So it's a friendly critique. They're saying like, look, I'm not demanding freedom of speech to criticize our goals. I share the same goals as you. We just need to be pragmatic. So he continues and he says, Marxism, Leninism, with the spirit of pragmatism, in order to clear the way to realize socialism according to the will of the party, which is also the will of the people of the whole country. So this is a really friendly critique. Look, we are all Marxists. We just need to talk openly about how to get to socialism. So, Yen, I met you when you were giving a presentation about one of the most important figures of the Nyanvan Zaifam, which is Nguyen Minh Do. So what are your thoughts on
Right.
him and why is he important for this?
Well, Wen Meidong is kind of known for this one essay that appeared within the first couple of issues of Zaifam that calls out in the title, it says correcting the land reform mistake, something very blatant like this. And he lays out the different things that the party had done in carrying out the land reforms incorrectly, leading to a lot of atrocities and deaths. But what I remember from reading this essay was, as you say, there was no animosity in the critique. It was that, well, we have come this far. We try to implement something from China. It didn't quite work because of these reasons. And if we address these particular areas, then we can improve. You know, like when I think about grading a student's paper, bad feedback is saying, this is a bad paper, or like, you're a bad student. Good feedback is saying, these sentences can be reworked so that you can make your argument stronger, something like that, so that it leads you to a better outcome. And I think what you're saying about the functionality of free speech, it really plays out here, where there is an end goal, and that end goal is very obvious in the criticism. It's not just a complaint, is my point.
Just briefly, because Nguyen Minh Do gives this speech, and then the Communist Party. So Nguyen Minh Do was never part of the party. He also never said he was against their goals, and he never said he was against Marxism. The reason that the party said they had a problem with Nguyen Minh Do was not because of his speech, but because the speech was leaked into the enemy capitalist world. Like somebody had taken the speech and then given it to capitalists who can then exploit the speech and use it to make the communists look bad. And so so that's why they were really upset with him. And then he said, look, it's not my fault that my speech got leaked to the enemy. One reason that the Communist Party was really full of anxiety about these debates about free speech, because they're like, okay, if you want to criticize us, do it, but do it within the family and don't let the enemy hear. They're going to use it to make us look bad and weaken us.
Just to specify, this speech, I believe Nguyen Minh Do was asked to do this speech before the party. So he was prompted. And then the tea is that he had maybe given his speech to like 2 or 3 people, one of whom was Zhong Jing. I forget who the other person was. And so it was implied in this interview that he did with this journalist that one of these friends that he had who had invited him to do the talk had leaked the speech.
I had heard that like it had fallen into the hands of Vietnamese correspondents in Rangoon, who sent
Mm-hmm.
it to Saigon, where it was published in full in many papers.
Right, but how did it fall into the hands of these people?
That's interesting. About the enemies, just really quick, because the party was really concerned about enemies. And so the argument made by the Nyanvan Pham was basically, look, your excessive paranoia of enemies is hurting us. Because when you become so paranoid of enemies, you become irrational, and then you start to see enemies everywhere and start
Mm.
mistaking people for being enemies when really
Mm.
they're your friends. So, for example, I'm going to quote someone, an anonymous writer from the Nyanvan Pham. He said, if you see something, say it. Know where to say it, think of how to say it, and say it all. Say it out loud. The truth is always the truth. But if there are no opposing opinions, how can there be truth? We are not afraid of the enemy exploiting and distorting anything because the nature of our regime is good.
Mm.
And in the progress of that regime, there were mistakes. Just outline those mistakes to overcome. Doing so will allow the regime to become more and more mature, and this will show that our regime is good. There's no need then to be afraid of the enemy taking advantage. So the idea here is that if you just allow free speech to do its thing, then you will become strong and you won't have to worry about the enemy.
Actually, Win Tung had said something about trust, referring back to that unwritten agreement that I had mentioned between intellectuals and the party officials. The
Yeah.
party officials were becoming so paranoid that they were mistrusting their friends, the intellectuals. There was a piece that had written saying that trust is better than doubt.
And you totally need trust to have political power. I mean, that's what political power is. It's people acting together for a cause, and you need trust for that to happen.
Hmm. And I mean, the only reason why criticism and self criticism wouldn't work is if people aren't thinking about the greater cause, like they're prioritizing themselves.
Nguyen Van Thuong also noticed that because the party was not allowing people to speak freely, people started acting fake. They started acting robotic, and that
Mm,
behind closed doors, they will then suddenly change. They will laugh and they'll joke and they'll actually be their real selves. And that's really bad for the party because then the party will never know how the people actually feel. And how can
mm,
you serve the people when you don't know how they feel?
mm-hmm. So, on that note about robots, there
Yes.
was a piece that was written by a very funny pen name called Jam Ban Biem, which, if you are familiar with Vietnamese, Jam Biem means to satirize. And so this is the pen name of some writer. And the short story is called The Robot Poet. And it's about this poet after the revolution, after socialist realism has been prescribed. So this robot poet can write poems very easily and very quickly. It's kind of like
Mm.
AI today, actually.
Wow. Wow.
Um,
Okay. Yeah.
and this poet comes to this village, he writes these poems, everybody loves it. And then after a while, though, the poems get boring because
Mm-hmm.
it creates the same poems over and over and over
Mm.
again. And the village poet, who has been replaced by this poet, he's like, see, humans can create better things because we create things with emotions and there's
Mm.
variability. And so eventually, actually, the robot poet is ditched and it's been discarded because eventually people decide that's not what they want or need. And this is kind of a
Yeah.
comment on the prescription of how cultural productions should be created is that we can't just prescribe socialist realism or the way that people should write because first of all it just doesn't reflect human experiences or like the depth of human experiences, and if it does it's going to get old. It's going to get old. And so I love that short story so much. I see you nodding and no one can see you nodding,
Yes.
but do you want to comment on that before I
Yes.
move
No,
on?
I'm just like I'm jumping out of my chair because this is exactly what I notice reading it as well. They really want to create a kind of socialism that really celebrates and affirms the reality of human diversity. They're always saying that, like, look, reality is diverse, and humans are diverse in terms of character, personality, taste, temperament. And so there's this one man who went by the initials HL, and he said, there's no reason to disagree with hundreds of flowers blooming. A regime is strong when it has 100 flowers. Just a little thought is enough to see that life is diverse. People live their own lives and die each day. Each person has his own or her own ability and disability. How many people have the same dream? In addition to soft, melodious people, there are bold and loud people. The road to socialism, accompanied by millions of people, brought with it many colors of the soul, many hopes, dreams, and thoughts. The creativity of socialism is a collective work of a large and colorful crowd. This other part is really interesting. So this guy named Drun, he says, in the realm of art, how many warm memories have been stored in the hearts of writers and artists for 10 years that have not been expressed? So much so that some people liken it to a blood clot that has not been dissolved precisely because of the lack of democracy and open criticism. So if you don't express yourself, that's like a blood clot. You need to express.
Interesting. So one important thing to mention in terms of the culture productions is a number of writings of Zheng Jing. And Zheng Jing was general secretary of the party, very important figure. And he had written two key essays. One was Theses on Vietnamese Culture, and the other one was Marxism and Vietnamese Culture. And these two essays really crystallize the party vision of what Vietnamese culture production should look like, at least after the war. This is where he introduced socialist realism. Actually, how would I describe this genre, Kevin? It's a literary genre that prioritizes the masses and the working class. So their struggles, they focus on their life experiences as a working class toward revolution. I feel like I can't say much about it because to me, it's a very flat genre modeled after Russian literature. It's basically art that promotes the goals of socialism. And so in these essays of Zheng Jing, he also talks about how art cannot be abstract. It cannot have multiple interpretations, which for someone who studies literature as art, what? Like, how can you not have multiple interpretations? That's against what socialist realism would stand for. There cannot be ambiguity, essentially. And he was adamant about representing the working class to the point where he would say, go to the factories and do research and use that research to write literature or to create art, because that is what the masses can relate to. He was really flattening, actually, the capability, the capacity for the Vietnamese people, especially after colonialism, to appreciate art, I think, because even though he was saying that, oh, of course we can appreciate art, in saying that we had to really take away ambiguity and we had to make art this one very univocal thing, that to me, that means dumbing down the masses, or like assuming that your masses don't have the education. And okay, to be fair, many of the Vietnamese people were peasants and didn't have an elitist education, but they could still look at something and read something and feel in response to that piece of art. So anyway, that is something I wanted to point out. And this is why I think the Nhân văn Pham is just so fascinating, because they were also responding to these essays of Zheng Jing.
So, on my view, many of the writers in the Nhân văn Pham were arguing that the goal is to create a socialism that affirms the reality of human diversity. And so when we think about socialist realism art, where it gives this ideal representation of what life would look like under socialism, right? Like propaganda posters. Do you think that the Nhân văn Pham promoted socialist realism?
Hard no. And for particularly the reason that you had talked about before about human diversity. And I can cite two writings, one from Nguyễn Minh Tường and one from Trần Dân. So, and these are two known writers. of the Nyanban Pham period. So the one from Women I want to talk about is a lesser known piece because he's always known for that first essay that we mentioned. And this one is called Vukap, so laughing and crying at the same time. So he talks about this French literature example of Gargantua. And I don't know if you're familiar with Gargantua, but he's this giant who eats a lot, and then he has a wife who also eats a lot. Anyway, the wife gives birth to his son but dies. And so Women is saying, okay, when we look at this example, do we cry because the wife has died, or do we laugh because of the happiness and the joy that the son has been born? And the intention, though, is that there is a progression, that there is a mourning, we do cry, but we also feel happy, and that there's a progression toward the happiness, but both is necessary. And so you have to laugh in order to cry, and sometimes this happens at the same time, and that's kind of the breadth and depth of human emotions. And he relates that to the politics and even the experience of a human. And this is related to the Denzhen piece I also want to mention. So Denzhen is a key figure in Nyanban Pham, and arguably even set the roots of Nyanban Pham before the actual works of Pham and Nyanban in 1956. But Denzhen has this poem called We Must Win. I want to read actually two short passages from the poem because it just shows exactly this depth, but also the progression. And so I think the progression is really important to still align with the ideology of the party. So the beginning of the poem starts off gloomy. It says, I live on Sinthu Street. 2 people, a small house full of love, but why was life not joyful? I'm going to skip a little bit. I live on Sinthu Street. Those sorrowful days I walk on, seeing no street, seeing no house, only the rain falling upon the red flag. This refrain of I live on Sinthu Street continues throughout, but at the end, it picks up. We live on Sinthu Street. My love, today, let's close the door and go out to join the demonstration, raise the red flag, and sing until our lungs burst of everyone in cities and countryside, the hungry, the sated, the rich, the poor, those who are happy, those living in sadness, everyone out to the streets, let's go. He was criticized for this poem because even though the direction of the poem is still positive, by the end, he's calling for unification, independence. Look, we did it. Let's all go to the streets. Let's celebrate. Let's demonstrate. The beginning of the poem is so ambivalent. And it's like, we had just fought this war. I'm on the streets. I don't know where people are. I don't know where I am. And things look like they're everywhere. It's what you can imagine as the after effects of war. Imagine the streets are empty and it just feels very desolate. And he was especially criticized because of that, because he's putting the red flag in that context. And like, how dare you feel so desolate after this victory that we've just attained, despite the direction of the poem. And so it's relating to the Nguyen piece because there's the same direction of positivity. And yet that positivity is discounted because it's laid next to the natural ambivalence of human emotion, which is sometimes we feel uncertain and sometimes we feel loss.
That's interesting because can't one make the argument that, well, the Nyanvan Pham was promoting their version of socialist realism, which is that in a good socialist society, it would be diverse with complex, ambiguous emotions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's possible. I mean, for me, I respond to the question, is Nyanban Pham promoting socialist realism as a hard no because of what I understand of socialist realism. But if you present to me that perhaps there is a new version that they're trying to promote, I could buy that. Yeah.
It was also interesting to see what kinds of arguments were being made against the Nyanvan Pham. For example, so in Nguyen Minh Tuong's memoir, An Excommunicated, he imagines this dialogue with one of his Communist Party critics. And this party leader says to him, in contradiction to what you, Nguyen are thinking the socialist happiness is the opposite of the capitalist happiness because it is that of the workers who at the sweat of their brows conquer the joy of life, while happiness in the capitalist countries is the result of exploitation, soaked with the tears and blood of the poor. Well, you are demanding freedom of opinion for the people. Are you aware of what this is all about? Is it an open door to all kinds of raving generated by ignorance, incomprehension, ill will, partialities, and sometimes insane fantasies? Many people paid by the enemy take advantage of this to rail against communism and sow animosity and hatred against the leaders. The entire
Mm.
society then suffers from the resulting violence and disorder. This imagined interlocutor then refers to the fact that Nguyen Minh Tuong had spent many years in France and that Nguyen Minh Tuong was the first Vietnamese to get 2 doctorates in France in law and literature. And, and this imagined interlocutor says, Tuong, you have been, quote, deformed by Western culture. You are falling into skepticism. You have doubt about everything. You can no longer perceive the grandeur of of the beings and things. You are losing yourself in the details and no longer see the overall, and particularly you criticize everything.
Maybe that's true, but he was the one who said trust is better than doubt, especially in the context of a polity, like a governing group. You trust that everyone has the same goal in mind as you, but the skepticism is part of that process.
And this really is such a classic tension in the history of
Right,
political
right.
thought. The tension between philosophy on one hand and politics on the other. So, on the one hand, philosophy, you're searching for the truth. You value critical thinking and thinking for yourself. And then on the other
Mm-hmm.
hand, the demands of politics sometimes just are like, get along with the program, stop questioning so many things, like stop raising a ruckus, you know?
Yeah, yeah. That's
And
why
and so
democracy is not very effective sometimes.
Right. And so there's this article called The Venom or the Poison of the Newspaper Nhân Văn. One person says, the danger of the Nhân Văn Giải Pham newspapers is that they raise the issue of freedom and democracy without raising the issue of discipline. So you need
Mm.
balance, this guy argues. Through our many years of struggle, we have all clearly seen a very common principle. Democracy without centralization and freedom without discipline will lead to anarchy. So this is really interesting. It is kind of a balancing act. Like, you know how some people, at least in the US, they're like, oh, you really should not censor anything because that's a slippery slope to tyranny. You can also make the opposite argument, and you could say, if you allow this speech, then you are on the slippery slope to anarchy.
Kevin, this is what we're seeing right now playing out in the US. For those who may not be following the news, but in the wake of the Palestine and Israeli war, there has been all of this uproar on university campuses about anti-Semitism, because any defense of Palestine is then related to anti-Semitism. And so it has escalated to the point where UPenn's president has resigned because she was on trial regarding free speech. There's now
Respect.
pushback against universities because if you don't lay a hard line on free speech, then you're saying that certain speech is privileged. So there needs to be
Well,
the
so,
hard line.
so this is an interesting discussion because, first off, all societies limit speech. I don't think that anyone can make a defense of free speech in which free speech is unlimited, even just for the sake of order. Like, for example, if you have a political speaker being shouted down by somebody, you eventually have to decide as a society whose speech to privilege, right? The
Mm-hmm.
shouter or the politician. And if everyone is speaking at once in a room, you need to decide who can speak first. And so you need to limit free speech.
Bringing things back, though, I mean, you were talking about the tension between philosophy and politics, and this is why Nguyen Minh Thuong chose philosophy. He chose
Well,
intellectual
to
freedom.
be fair, he was banned from
Okay,
politics. He
yes,
was excommunicated. So even if he wanted
yes.
to participate in politics, he couldn't.
His position would be like, I don't want to anyway.
Right.
So we shared a lot about the Pham in this episode, a little bit from each of our respective fields through literature and arts and through political theory. We talked about how this group was not necessarily a dissident group, but were probably just reformers within the communist ideology. For me, I think it was really fascinating that we talked about expression in different ways. For me, it was the creative expression, and for you, it was like a political expression. How do I participate in society as a member of the society? It's really nice to not have one underlying position, but that we can approach this particular time period of Vietnamese history through these different disciplinary lenses. So, what would you say is the takeaway for this episode, Kevin?
Well, for me, right, because then I'm going to ask you the same thing right after this. So for me, what I learned from the Nhân văn Giải Pham is this new way of seeing free speech, that free speech can actually be part of a revolutionary strategy, and that if you want to change the world with a group of people, you need power. What is
Mm,
power? Power is the capacity to act in concert, to act together. And
mm-hmm,
this means that you need people to agree with you and to consent to your ideas. It's this kind of fellow feeling, and like, yeah, like everyone raises their fist together and they really believe it together. And then they do it together.
mm-hmm,
That is power. And you cannot have that if you don't have free speech, because as Nguyen Minh Tung says, it if you don't allow free speech, then people start being afraid of each other and they start like acting fake and robotic. And that's a source of
mm-hmm.
political weakness because it withers away this genuine fellow feeling, this collective love and solidarity. You're forced to be fake out of fear, and that diminishes power for whatever cause you have. So that's one thing that I take from it. How about you?
Right. I mean, just to quickly respond, like when I think about the friends that I trust the most is the friends that I can freely express myself with.
You
There's a
expect they can speak freely to you, right?
exactly. So for me, my takeaway from this episode would be that I really find that these writers, artists who participated in the Nhân văn Giải Phóng period took the revolution and its potentiality really seriously. And a lot of that was subscribing to a communist ideology. I think a lot of people really believed in it. I think it just really nuances what revolution entails. So for you, it was that free speech is integral to revolution. And then for me, it's that there's a lot of work to do after revolution. Sometimes it has to do with mitigating the many different versions that we thought revolution was going to be. And how do we consolidate
Right.
that in such a way? Or at least respect it and maybe create various avenues in which one can still practice those many nuanced revolutionary visions but within a larger umbrella. I don't know, I'm not like a revolutionary theorist or anything, but my takeaway is that these writers who participated in this movement took the revolution very seriously and they tried their best to make it sustainable. I think that's really important.
And if I could quote someone who they claim that they were following, which is Ho Chi Minh, and he succinctly defined revolution as destroying the bad, creating the good. And what's interesting about the Nhân văn Giải Pham is they could say, well, we need free speech in order to say what is bad and to say what is good. And that's always
Mm.
going to be a debate as the experiment in this new revolution and socialist experiment unfolds.
So we hope you learned something new from this episode. I surely did, actually. Thank you, Kevin, for everything you
Same
shared
here.
on free
Thank you.
speech. And
Happy holidays.
we'll see you next year with another episode of Nam Dialogues.